What truly makes a smartphone camera shine? I mean, is simply about raw megapixels or maybe the fancy glass lenses? Or is there something, far more subtle and powerful at play?
It's a great question.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of the most talked about, maybe even debated, mobile cameras out there, the Google Pixel.
Yes, the Pixel.
It's a device known for a genuinely distinctive approach. It sets itself apart not just with hardware, but primarily through its really sophisticated software and artificial intelligence.
Right, what Google famously pioneered as computational photography.
Exactly that.
It's been quite a journey to watch, hasn't it? The Pixel camera has evolved continuously, like with every single new generation.
For sure.
And that evolution has led to a really diverse range of perceptions
Yeah.
about when it was, at its absolute peak performance.
Absolutely. So today, our mission is really to peel back the layers on these generational changes. We want to pinpoint the eras of greatest critical acclaim, user acclaim too, and really dissect the fascinating factors that have shaped user preference. Essentially, we're aiming to answer the big question for you. When was the Pixel camera truly liked most?
Yeah, when did it hit that sweet spot?
To really get that, though, we have to go back to its roots, long before the Pixel phone even existed, I think, to understand the philosophy that shaped it.
Right. Google actually stepped into the camera tech scene way back in 2011.
Really 11, wow.
Yeah, with Mark Lavoie leading some pretty groundbreaking image fusion research. Now, this work was initially for Google Glass, remember that?
Oh yeah, Google Glass.
But it ultimately laid the groundwork for what would become the Pixel camera app on Android. It basically established Google's core software-first approach right from the start.
That feels like a visionary move back then.
It really was. They recognized early on that just piling on sensors or lenses wasn't the only path to a great photo.
Right.
If your software was intelligent enough, it could compensate and maybe even outperform hardware-heavy rivals. That emphasis on computational photography became their defining thing.
And when we look at how that philosophy translated to the actual hardware, those first few phones, it's pretty telling. The first Pixel, 2016, had a 12.3 megapixel main camera. But what's notable, it initially shipped without optical image stabilization, OIS.
Yeah, that was a surprise to some.
Then Pixel 2 in 2017 kept a similar 12.2 megapixel sensor, but added crucial upgrades like an f1.8 aperture, so more light for better low-light shots.
Right, important.
And maybe more importantly, OIS. Finally, vital for reducing blur from shaky hands.
Definitely needed that.
It also gained dual-pixel autofocus, made focusing incredibly fast, really accurate.
And didn't the Pixel 2 introduce something else, a special chip?
Ah, yes, the Pixel Visual Core. A dedicated chip designed specifically to speed up complex image stuff like HDR plus LO and save battery while doing it.
Right, offloading the main processor.
Then the Pixel 3 in 2018, still that single 12.2 megapixel rear camera, f1.8, but they made a big addition to the front.
Right, the selfies.
A dual camera system, an 8 megapixel primary, and an 8 megapixel ultra wide, specifically for getting more people or more background into group selfies.
That ultra-wide front camera was a smart move. And all this time, the Pixel Visual Core was still central to the processing.
So the hardware was evolving, but this is really where the software revolution gained serious momentum.
Absolutely. Take HDR plus Jim. That feature was refined from their earlier Nexus phones, but it became like the Pixel's signature.
How did it work exactly? It wasn't just simple HDR.
No, not at all. It intelligently analyzed a rapid burst of frames looking for the sharpest parts. They called lucky imaging.
Lucky imaging, okay.
And then it seamlessly merged them. The
Yeah.
result,
Okay.
dramatically increased dynamic range, much less noise, and incredibly vibrant, enhanced colors. And the key thing,
What's that?
on the original Pixel, HDR Plus was the default mode. This complex magic was just always happening in the background. You didn't even think about it.
That's confidence in your tech. And speaking of groundbreaking, let's talk Night Sight.
Oh, Night Sight, yes.
When that debuted on the Pixel 3 and they later backported it to the 1 and 2, it just felt like actual magic for low-light photos. I remember seeing the results. Just blown away.
It genuinely did feel like magic, didn't it? I mean, the photos it could pull out of near darkness were incredible.
How did they do it? How did they make those impossible shots suddenly just work?
Well, it used an exposure stacking technique, kind of similar to what astrophotographers do.
Yay.
It captured multiple long exposure shots, sometimes up to 15 frames or even like 6 frames at 1 second each, for up to a 6-second total exposure.
6 seconds handheld. How?
Through sophisticated motion metering, basically, detecting and accounting for your tiny hand movements while you held the phone,
Okay.
and tile-based processing, breaking the image into smaller parts to process more efficiently. The result was remarkably bright, crisp, detailed, low-light photos, no tripod needed. It really democratized that kind of photography.
It really did. They also delivered a brilliant portrait mode. Came to the Pixel 2 first. I think it was called lens blur initially.
That's right, lens blur first.
And that used information from the dual pixel sensors, the parallax info, plus machine learning.
To create that nice, shallow depth of field, that bokeh effect everyone loves, the Pixel 3 refined it further.
And who could forget super res zoom on the Pixel 3? That was clever.
Very clever, using the tiny shifts from your natural hand movements to get higher resolution when zooming digitally. Google claimed it was like having 2-3x optical zoom.
So the impact of these first few pixels, it was huge, right?
Oh, immense. The Pixel 1 actually achieved a record-high DxOMark mobile score back in 2016, 89.
For people who don't follow DxOMark, that's a big independent camera benchmark.
Exactly. And the Pixel 1 was praised for natural-looking outdoor images, good low-light detail, accurate exposures, fast autofocus. Reviewers literally hailed it as the best smartphone camera we've tested to date.
Wow.
Then the Pixel 2 set an even higher record, 98 on DxOMark, lauded for excellent autofocus and good detail preservation. And lots of users, lots of reviewers still cite the Pixel 2 as a personal favorite because of that camera and its sort of natural look.
And the Pixel 3.
Scored 101 on DxOMark, tied with the iPhone XR at the time for single-lens phones. Celebrated for, by far, the best camera improvement, especially portrait mode, and of course, the miracle of night sight.
So the real breakthrough here, the main takeaway from Pixels 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, the core insight is how Google fundamentally redefined the mobile camera game. They proved that software smarts, not just hardware specs, could catch up and even surpass competitors.
Right.
It created this perception of magic because it didn't just take pictures, it reliably took the right picture, the one you wanted, most of the time. That shifted user expectations and, honestly, the whole industry's focus.
It absolutely shifted everything. Okay, so moving into the next era, Pixel 4 and 5. This felt like a period of hardware experimentation and, interestingly, more user control.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The Pixel 4 in 2019, that was Google's first phone with dual rear cameras.
Finally.
Right. They added a 16-megapixel telephoto lens, 2x optical zoom. This was clearly a response to people wanting optical zoom.
But controversially.
They left out the ultra-wide. Exactly. They omitted the ultra-wide, relying on super res zoom to kind of cover that gap computationally. That was a big talking point. Showed how much faith they had in their software zoom.
Okay, but then Pixel 5 in 2020, they did a complete 180.
They did. Replaced the telephoto with a 16-megapixel ultra-wide camera, about 107-degree field of view.
Why the switch?
Google said it was based on their assessment of what users actually preferred for everyday shooting. They figured people wanted the wider perspective more often than the optical telephoto.
Interesting.
And the main camera sensor, crucially, remained largely consistent, again reinforcing their confidence in the software side.
And the software did keep evolving in this period. Pixel 4 brought live HDR plus LET.
Ah, yes, the LUWISI viewfinder. What you see is what you get.
Right, so you could actually see a preview of the HDR effect before you took the shot. More predictable.
Definitely. And it also introduced dual exposure controls.
Okay, what was that?
Separate sliders, one for overall brightness, one specifically for the shadows. It gave users much more granular control over the final image look.
More creative control, then.
Exactly. And there was the Pixel Neural Core, too, pushing the hardware-accelerated processing even further.
And the Pixel 5 built on that.
Yeah, Pixel 5 enhanced HDR, plus, again, adding bracketing. It incorporated longer exposure frames for even better detail and noise reduction.
Okay.
Plus, they added portrait light, a clever post-processing trick. Lets you add directional lighting to portraits after you took them, like simulating studio lights.
That sounds useful.
So this whole era, 4 and 5, it showed Google exploring what a complete camera system meant, hardware-wise, while still leaning very heavily on their software prowess.
And how did users feel about these? Sentiment still seemed pretty positive.
Generally, yes. The Pixel 4 got praised for rendering diverse skin tones really well, its color science. And the Pixel 5 delivered strong image quality, even though it used a mid-range chipset. DxOMark highlighted its software power.
Right.
People liked other things too, like the Pixel 4's motion sense, the face unlock. And the Pixel 5 was appreciated for being compact, bringing back the rear fingerprint sensor.
But the key camera nuance here was that move towards giving users more direct control. live HDR plus dual exposure.
Exactly. It signaled a subtle shift from the pure magic box approach. Google was kind of saying, here's our incredible tech, but now you get more of a say in the final result, too.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. More transparency in the computational process. A subtle but significant departure from just pure point-and-shoot magic.
Precisely.
And that brings us neatly to the Tensor era, starting with the Pixel 6. And this feels like a truly aggressive push into AI.
Oh, absolutely. This was a huge hardware leap, too, with Google's own custom Tensor chip debuting in 2021.
Engineered specifically for this kind of stuff.
Exactly, to push software and computations. The Pixel 6 featured a significantly larger 50-megapixel main sensor. Captured, they claimed, 150% more light than the Pixel 5.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Huge. And a 12.5-megapixel ultra-wide. The Pixel 6 Pro went further, adding a 48-megapixel telephoto with 4x optical zoom.
So Tensor really unlocked a new level of AI for photos.
It really did. On-device AI got a massive boost. With Pixel 6, we saw features like real tone,
Right, for skin tones.
using AI to intelligently adjust color balance for accurate representation of diverse skin tones. A really important focus.
Definitely.
Then there was Magic Eraser. That got a lot of attention.
Oh yeah, remove stuff from photos.
Effortlessly remove unwanted objects, people, whatever. AI just seamlessly fills in the background. And motion mode for creating artistic blurs like action pan or long exposure simulations right on the phone.
So with Tensor established, it seems Google just kept doubling down on AI features in the later models.
They absolutely did. It became the defining characteristic of the Tensor era cameras.
What were some other standout AI features we saw in the Pixel 7, 8, and even the 9?
Okay, so Pixel 7 brought photo unblur, using AI to sharpen up blurry faces or even entire photos, including old ones from your gallery, not just ones taken on the Pixel.
That's clever. Rescuing old memories.
Yeah. Then Pixel 8 introduced Best Take. You take a burst of group photos, and it lets you swap faces from different shots to create one single perfect picture where everyone's looking good.
Huh, solves a common problem.
Totally. And the really big one on Pixel 8 was Magic Editor. This was deep generative AI. Let you do complex stuff like completely reframing a shot, expanding the image, moving subjects around, changing the sky.
Whoa, okay, that's heavy editing.
Very much so. And the Pixel 9 continued this with Add Me, a neat trick to intelligently add the photographer into a group shot after it's been taken. These are seriously impressive on-device AI editing tools.
They sound incredible on paper, like technically amazing.
Yeah.
But this is also where we start to see that real split in how users felt, right? Leading to this over-processing controversy.
That's exactly where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite contentious. While the cameras were technically more capable than ever, this period saw them increasingly described with words like boring.
Boring, after all that tech.
Yeah, or that they no longer stood out. You started hearing a lot of nostalgia, people saying they missed the contrast, the color, and the vibrancy of years past.
Like the earlier Pixels.
Exactly. For instance, the Pixel 6 Pro. While some definitely found its images vivid and alive, it also faced criticism for having too much HDR, making things look flat or lifeless, especially in the shadows.
Okay.
And the Pixel 7 and 7 Pro seemed to encounter significant user dissatisfaction. We saw reports online about terrible photo quality. Complaints included things like iffy autofocus, especially in low light, night sight, maybe taking a step back with moving subjects getting blurry, excessive noise, or over-sharpening.
And the HDR again?
And overly aggressive HDR, yeah. Leading to weird contrasty halos around objects or oversaturated colors. Plus, persistent complaints about video quality continued.
What about the Pixel 8?
Mixed reviews. Praised for excellent camera quality overall and those cool AI features, sure. But a noticeable segment of users found the images dull and lifeless, specifically because of the processing.
And the latest, Pixel 9. Similar issues.
Recent complaints seem to highlight a mismatch between the viewfinder preview and the final photo you get, often showing inaccurate color balance or just appearing overprocessed. Again, that overzealous HDR seems to be a culprit, and users get frustrated because you often can't easily disable it or tone it down.
So connecting this to the bigger picture, this era, the Tensor era, saw a fundamental shift. It feels like Google moved from subtly enhancing reality, like in the early days, to actively creating an enhanced or maybe even social media optimized version of reality.
Yeah, it's a very good way to describe the perception, yes. While the on-device AI is incredibly impressive from a tech standpoint, it led to these complaints from users who just preferred a more natural, less manipulated output.
The artistic choices baked into Google's algorithms became the issue, especially since you couldn't always control them.
Precisely. It's almost like the images entered an uncanny valley. Technically amazing, maybe even perfect by some standard, but aesthetically unsettling or just
Yeah.
not what the user wanted.
So you get this growing gap between objective technical performance, like the Dixomark scores might still be high, and the subjective user experience. Technically, better images can paradoxically feel unnatural or just disappointing to some users.
Exactly that tension.
Okay, so after tracking this whole roller coaster of an evolution, the big question remains, when was a pixel camera most liked by its users? Where was that peak?
Based on this whole journey, tracking the reviews, the user comments, the general sentiment, that early peak, specifically the Pixel 2 and 3 era,
Yeah.
really stands out. That seems to be the time of magic and widely appreciated naturalism.
Groundbreaking at the time.
Absolutely. They established new benchmarks for what smartphone photography could be.
And what were the core strengths then that resonated so strongly with people?
Well, number one, groundbreaking low light with night sight. That was almost universally seen as magic.
Yep.
And HDR plus. It delivered that wide dynamic range, pulling detail from shadows and highlights, but without making the photo look obviously processed or fake.
Kept it looking real.
Exactly. Photos were consistently praised back then for their natural look, their lifelike white balance, and rich colors. And maybe most importantly, users loved the sheer consistency, that point-and-shoot reliability. You felt like you'd get exactly the shot I want 9 times out of 10.
Just trust it to work.
Yeah. Plus, the Pixel 3's portrait mode was considered best in class for a while. The takeaway is that Google's computational photography back then solved major problems like low light, like dynamic range, without introducing heavy-handed artificial enhancements. It improved images while keeping them authentic.
It sounds like they really nailed that balance. But then you mentioned a brief vivid interlude with the Pixel 6 Pro.
Ah, yes. It's interesting because while the later Tensor era saw the overprocessing complaints rise, some users do specifically recall the Pixel 6 Pro period, that first Tensor chip generation, as a time when images felt notably vivid and alive.
So more punchy.
Yeah, capturing a level of contrast, color, and vibrancy that they really liked. This coincided with that first Tensor chip and the much larger 50-megapixel sensor. So it suggests maybe there was a unique initial balance of that new hardware, the early Tensor era processing, that really appealed to people who did want a more impactful, perhaps less strictly natural image before the processing maybe got pushed further in subsequent generations.
Okay, so that raises a really crucial question for you, the listener.
Yeah.
What exactly influenced these shifts in user preferences? Why did the sentiment change so dramatically over time? What were the driving factors?
I think the most significant dividing line really boils down to that tension between a natural look and what many perceive now as social media optimization.
Right.
Early Pixels, let's say 1 through 5, roughly, were widely lauded for their natural, true-to-life rendering. You took a picture, it looked like the scene. Later generations, maybe 6 onwards, are often perceived by users as prioritizing a look that's maybe instantly ready for Instagram, highly optimized.
Leading to those descriptions like,
Oversaturated, over-sharpened, sometimes weirdly dull or flat, despite the processing, or even lifeless. This push into that potential uncanny valley, technically impressive but aesthetically just off or unsettling to some, contributes to that feeling of the photos being boring or disappointing, even if they are objectively sharp or have wide dynamic range.
and control seems to be a huge factor here too.
Absolutely. A recurring complaint in recent generations is the diminished user control over Google's increasingly aggressive post-processing, especially the inability to easily just turn off or significantly dial back the HDR.
You feel kind of stuck with Google's default vision of a perfect photo.
Exactly. And while the AI editing features like Magic Editor offer incredible convenience and power, they often come at the cost of the original image's integrity. And maybe more importantly, the user's own creative control and intent.
That lack of control probably feeds into consistency issues too.
It seems to. Early Pixels were praised for being so dependable. Point, shoot, get a great shot. Newer models, however, have faced more complaints about inconsistency, especially with autofocus sometimes, and that noticeable mismatch between what you see in the viewfinder and the final processed image. What you see isn't always quite what you get anymore.
Yeah, that's frustrating. And we can't really wrap this up without touching on video again.
True. Video performance. Throughout the Pixel's history, it feels like video has faced persistent criticism, often lagging behind its still photo capabilities. Issues like inconsistent stabilization, sometimes limited dynamic range compared to stills, and focus hunting problems have popped up, particularly noted in some later models.
It just never seemed to reach the same heights as the photos.
Generally speaking, that seems to be the consensus, yeah.
Okay, so wrapping this up, you've seen that the Pixel camera's journey has been one of really constant innovation. From that magic of the Pixel 2 and 3 era, which arguably perfected natural computational photography,
Right, the golden age for many.
to that brief, maybe more vivid interlude with the Pixel 6 Pro for some users. And finally, landing in this current Tensor era, characterized by truly aggressive AI-driven enhancements and editing tools.
And while that's technically incredibly impressive, this evolution has definitely created a significant divergence in user sentiment. It seems to often prioritize these perfected or social media-ready images, perhaps at the expense of what some users see as photographic authenticity and, crucially, user control.
So this whole deep dive really highlights a critical question, I think, for the future of mobile photography everywhere, not just Pixel. Can this cutting-edge AI truly coexist with the diverse aesthetic preferences of users, especially those who still really value a natural, true-to-life image?
It's the key question.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we're seeing signs of this playing out. New camera apps are emerging, like Adobe's Project Indigo, which, by the way, is being developed by some former Pixel camera leads.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they are explicitly aiming for a more natural aesthetic and promising comprehensive manual controls.
What does that signal, then, about where smartphone cameras might be heading next? And maybe the most important question for you listening. What kind of photographic output do you truly prefer? The magic enhancement or the natural truth?
Something to think about.